Good evening. Welcome to everyone from wherever you are joining us from around the world. Thank you for joining this Global Government Forum webinar hosted with our knowledge partner for the event, Swiss Re. Today's topic is resilience, specifically resilience in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. How effectively have countries' public services supported citizens and businesses during the pandemic? How well equipped are countries to weather the recession? And which financial, economic and social weaknesses threaten their ability to protect citizens' lives and livelihoods over the next year? In order to answer those questions, we have convened a top-flight panel of experts. Our first speaker is Jérôme Hegeli, Group Chief Economist at Swiss Re, who will present the conclusions of his company's research into resilience around the world. Then we have Markus Zavala, Director General and Economic Policy Coordinator in the Ministry of Finance in Finland, who will talk about his country's experience. Next, Professor Domenico Siniscalco, former Director General of the Italian Treasury and Italian Minister of Economy and Finance, currently Managing Director and Vice Chairman of Morgan Stanley Europe, will reflect on Italy's position and provide a wider European perspective. And finally, Veronica Scotti, Chairperson, Public Sector Solutions at Swiss Re, will address how both public and private sector organisations can work together to boost resilience. Following the presentations, there will be a question and answer session, so please do send through your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. Jérôme, could I hand over to you, please?
Thank you very much, Adam, and also very warm welcome from my side. My name is Jérôme, and I hope you're all very well. So let's start with a few minutes in terms of providing some background of how we at Swiss Re we look at resilience. Resilience is really, I think, at the core what we need right now in terms of rebuilding our economies, and is really at the core of what we do also in the insurance industry. Very, very much pleased to showcase what we have been doing in the recent past, but also more back in the past. Let me start. If I look at this picture, yes, it's chilly out there. It's winter. It's winter in terms of the global economic environment. It's, however, all not that bad. You also see sunshine out there. Sunshine out there is coming from, I think, also the better news. The very recent better news on the COVID vaccine front. It's super encouraging, and it brightens up also the macro outlook without a doubt. However, I think the recovery hill remains steep, and up on the recovery hill, we really need to make sure that we get economic resilience back on track. So very pleased to also show you what we mean by the economic resilience concept, which is also very much at the heart of how we look at the various economies. So with this introduction comments, if you can look quickly at the next slide, let me introduce you our pandemic clock. Pandemic clock on the left-hand side, what you see and what you get is on the y-axis, you see the basic reproduction rate of COVID-19, and on the x-axis, you see the change in the mobility indices. These are the Google mobility indices as well as the Apple mobility indices. And what we have been doing and what we continue to do, and also provide to the public at large to our resilience portal, is data. Data is super important, but also how to handle the data. And what we are doing in terms of tracking where we are in terms of the economic path is looking at where we are in terms of mobility. That is data you get on a daily basis, as well as superseded of how an economy is structured. Obviously, a service-led economy with a large share of restaurants, hospitality or airlines is going to be differently affected with an economy which is largely manufacturing based. You see on the right-hand side, you see the Gdp Shortfall Index. It tells you with zero where we have been before the really outbreak and the lockdowns, economic lockdowns of COVID-19. And you see all around the world, and especially still, unfortunately, in Europe, we are still in economic lockdowns, and you see it in terms of capacity shortfalls, which are around 10%. These are very important indicators also for economic growth and economic outlook. And you also see with the gray line that China definitely is back on track, having also eased their restrictions and having been very successful in managing COVID-19. So pandemic macro clock, the various quadrants, obviously we are still not in the sweet spot. You see the G7 is in the reddish quadrant, but definitely I think looking ahead, not just the vaccine developments, but also without the vaccine developments, I would really doubt that we're going to go where we have been in terms of economic lockdowns in the past. So point number one, looking at the data, pandemic clock gives you a very good picture of where we are today. Not in the sweet spot, definitely still a very difficult economic environment. And fact is, Europe is still facing a double dip recession. We continue to expect a contraction happening as we speak in this quarter. Now from the shorter cyclical outlook and having showcased you some of the newer analytical toolkits, let me broaden a little bit the perspective. And I'm really passionate about the economic resilience indices. On the next slide, if you can go to the next slide, please. On the next slide, you see the economic resilience indices. We provide this on an annual basis. We have started last year to track 31 economies, the biggest 31 economies, so it's a G20 plus. We track them with a variety of indicators. We track the cyclical indicators. We call it buffers, fiscal buffers as well as monetary buffers. You see that in the legend, as well as track the structural drivers of an economy. And obviously an economy which has a higher labor market efficiency, a stronger human capital, as well as a better low carbon economy is better facing an economic shock. I really do believe the concept of economic resilience is super important in the context of COVID-19. It's also important to look at how was the economic resilience before COVID-19. According to our estimates, and it's out there in the public domain, and we are happy also to provide the data, and again, you do it on an annual basis, before COVID-19, and you see that with the line and for 2019, the global economic resilience globally, but also for the G7 and for Europe, it was lower than before the global financial crisis. And obviously, COVID-19 dragged it even further below. So now I think it's really important to build up the resilience, and building up the resilience can only be done if we improve monetary policy space, the fiscal space, but also think about the longer term. And that means getting long-term potential output growth up. In terms of which countries are moving and are improving, you see that on the right-hand side, and obviously there are various factors which drive these countries to be at the top or at the bottom. And definitely the relative movements are important to look at. Now, last slide, and then I hand over to the moderator. And the last slide, with one more month to go before Christmas, obviously we also have a wish list and a call for action. What can we do now to build better? What can we do now to make sure that this crisis is not wasted? And there again, I think the economic resilience concept comes in very handy and very useful. Now it's time to build up the post-crisis recovery and not just use the past crisis recipes, which were cheap money and spending like there is no tomorrow. 3 points I would like to highlight. Number one, infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure. Yes, I think that continues to be super important. Why? Because you get a lot of fiscal multipliers and creates jobs. Second, COVID-19, yes, it has an expiry date, and hopefully that expiry date is just around the corner. Climate change doesn't have an expiry date, and the cost of inaction is even greater. That's why I think greening the recovery is so important. And third, I really think COVID-19 is a wake-up call, and I would look forward also for more comprehensive risk analysis where data is at the heart of the analysis. And hopefully some of the research you have seen here can be inspiring in having the more comprehensive risk analysis. So with these introductory comments, happy to hand over back to you, Adam. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you. It was really interesting. Marcus, could I go to you next, please?
Thank you. and greetings from Helsinki, Finland. It's a great pleasure to be with distinguished experts here, and to be able to share a few of my comments regarding current situation. First, some comments regarding Finland in a sense of how the pandemic has affected Finnish economy and society. First, may I start with the good news? First, the thing is something which I check every morning at 8 a.m. when I'm receiving the report from the government information services regarding the COVID situation. The infection rate in Finland is now absolutely the lowest in European countries, and of course it's something very valuable for us, and perhaps it's also gives some hints how the things could be improved in other countries too. And also because the difference is so huge that even partly the difference can be explained by noting the very Finnish phenomenon that Finns are not easy coming close to each other, and the population density is low. There are many kind of technical reasons why Finnish rates are so low, but the difference is now so huge that I just calculated from the data of ECDC that there are 15 European countries where the infection rate is more than 20 times higher than in Finland. So this is so huge difference that it cannot be explained by just natural or cultural facts. And second good news is that there is no real information, no final information available regarding GDP for the third quarter of this year. But according to third quarter, Finland was one of countries having smallest GDP decline over the second quarter. And of course it's poor speculation, but at the moment, because there is no official figures available, but very likely Finland is doing relatively well also in the third quarter. But bad news. The bad news are basically coming from this huge differential between Finland and other European countries. It's very reasonable to assume at least some convergence. People are traveling. Also, this seasonal effect could be in Finland much more negative than in other countries. There is influenza period starting. So in Finnish case, it's reasonable to assume that the good figures in the Finnish case could look less positive in a few weeks' time. And second thing, what is important for the economics is that Finland is producing a lot of investment goods, and so very likely this kind of cyclical effect will affect Finnish economy later, and it could be that effect stemming from exports. The exports will materialize only with the lag in Finland. So the bad news is that these positive news could be less permanent. Secondly, may I very shortly comment these news regarding availability of vaccines. And of course, it's a really extremely good news that what we received yesterday. And our experts, health experts, this morning said me that news was so positive that almost no one could predict that. And secondly, but here is also bad news in the sense that already now we know that there will be no real effect stemming from any vaccination before next summer. So the overall situation will remain very similar until, let's say, next May or June, because the number of people who can be vaccinated will be relatively low next spring, and the real kind of population effects could be visible at earliest next summer, and so they very likely will affect the epidemic only in next autumn. And finally, topic of the discussion, this resilience is very interesting concept, because I feel that it's somehow touch upon the one of the facts why Finland has survived so well, because important part of the resilience is actually trust, that people trust authorities, people trust on each others, people basically assume that other people are acting in good faith, and they are basically at least partly competent and capable of doing what they are aiming. And this is something, this is my personal theory, that it very much explains why the Finnish situation has been so positive. People are eager to follow the advices the authorities are giving, because they simply trust authorities. And of course, the epidemic will have also consequences for the resilience. Again, there are bad news and there are positive news. Bad news, of course, it's needless to say that it will affect the public finances in all industrial countries very badly, and also as far as I understand that this is a global phenomenon, that the health sector has not served other patients properly during last half year. So in Finnish case, statistics show that there is missing 1 million dentist appointments, and these are things which will show up in health situation of the country in the long run. But on the positive side, of course, any kind of phenomenon has also positive sides. One simple thing to mention is actually that Finnish society, as many other industrial societies, learned in few weeks that distance working is almost as good as other working. So basically, all Finnish civil servants, all Finnish experts in the private firms are currently working from their homes, and things seem to work. Perhaps this is not something what we can continue endlessly without problems in a human communication, but in the short run we have been capable of doing everything else, and in some case, everything what people have performed beforehand, but in many cases, people found that they are basically now more productive than in previous life.
Fantastic.
That one was my.
Thank you, Marcus. Domenico, can I go to you next, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar, which is so interesting and with such a distinguished audience. I'll try to tell you and summarize what I see throughout Europe and the US, because at Morgan Stanley I'm doing Italy, I'm head of Italy, but I'm also head of government coverage in the EMEA region. And so I have a sort of bird's eye view of many, many different countries. In that respect, let me tell you that I'll try to highlight the similar features across European countries and more, and the main different features which still exist, particularly in the foreseeable future. Of course, there is some tendency in the public debate to focus within the national borders, and some let me say, provincial viewpoint as set forth in the debate. In some cases, these are completely justified. In other cases, they are less justified. So let me also focus on that. Let me start by saying that if you look at the available data, for example, collected by the Johns Hopkins University or by University of Oxford and published on the main newspaper, the pattern of these pandemics and its diffusion is fundamentally similar throughout the countries. Of course, there are countries where the effects have been less important, say Finland, as we just said, but overall the shape of the curve in the first and in the second wave is somehow the same. And therefore, when people complain about their own national pattern of epidemics and pandemics, this is a provincial view, because all the countries at different moment in time between January, in the case of China, Q4 2019, and spring, enter into the pandemic, and the number of infected people picked up, then plateaued, arrived to a ceiling, and then dropped down again in a similar way. Why is it so? Because, well, globalization facilitated the spread of the virus, of course, travels, mobility of people, etc. But also, this virus was affected everybody in every country in similar way. What was the impact of these pandemics also depended on the response by the different countries. And the response, believe it or not, has been again very similar, based on distancing, social distancing, and then lockdowns, which were adopted by almost all countries, say, except Sweden or except a few others, but fundamentally it was the same. And these remedies were somehow primitive, because they look very much like the remedies we adopted in 1918, when the Spanish flu affected our countries. I mean, you fundamentally keep people apart and lock them in at house to prevent an overall global spread. So the response has been similar, but I must say that the results have been very good overall, because I mean, if I look at the end from the plateau to the summer, the numbers of the pandemia were broadly reduced, went down near zero in all countries. So everybody was relieved and had a sense of relief. What was the problem? That in every country then all these measures of distancing, let alone lockdown, were abandoned. People went on holiday, people start meeting each other and working again. So it all started again with different forms somehow, because the virus probably mutated, and also because we learned a lot. So now the measures in all the European countries are fundamentally more targeted. There is no overall broad lockdown, even if we could end into the same situation. And the vaccine is coming back, but in a bit less, with lower mortality, so to say, lower lethal effects. Final point, which was somehow similar throughout Europe, was the economic impact, the one which was shown in the barometer, in the quantitative analysis, which was shown by Jerome at the beginning. GDP dropped in an unprecedented way. It dropped from 8 to 20%, according to the countries. But in almost every country, the rebound was pretty amazing. Say, think of Italy, because I know the numbers by heart. We had a drop of economic activity of about 10% on a yearly basis, almost less than 20% on a quarterly basis. But in the third quarter, the rebound was plus 16.7%. So a V-shaped recovery, which was seen, which had been seen as somehow skeptically by many observers, including myself. I had in mind a lower recovery, actually proved to be a possibility, because this was not a banking crisis, this was not a financial crisis, but rather it was an exogenous crisis. And when the depressing factor was removed at the end of the summer, the economy was very ready to come back. Europe reacted very well. I mean, better than the national countries, so to say. In the short run, we had the ECB PEP, the purchase program. We had the SURE plan, which is a support of the layoff scheme. We had ESM. No country has applied yet. We had the EIB. So in the short run, the idea was to provide a bridge from the beginning to the end of the crisis, with minimizing the number of casualties, minimizing the number of companies that went bankrupt, and minimizing the problems for individuals. The impact on public finance was dramatic. Okay, so no doubt it needs to be reabsorbed, but so far this is the only medicine, the only remedy from the economic viewpoint which is available. In the longer run, this is more interesting. Europe was the only country to set up the EU Recovery Fund, which is a fund specifically devoted to the structural transformation of the economy. Structural transformation means investment in areas which define a new and better growth path. New and better growth path means greening of the economy, digitalizing the economy, health expenditure, etc., etc. Because all the people I know that know a bit this phenomenon say that the world will not go back to the old habits. We will have a new economy somehow, that the COVID will be a watershed, and we need to update our economies. This recovery fund is a European specialty. In the US, for example, there is nothing like that. In China, I cannot say, because it's, the planning there is more important, but there is nothing formal like that. So it will be interesting. Of course, we come out of the crisis weaker because we spent all that money. We had a number of casualties of people that died. Many economic business models proved to be not viable. So there is plenty of situations like that. And I appreciate the Resilience Index, which was sent to us. The only observation I have on that index is that it lacks a measure of private sector wealth. And private sector wealth is a crucial shock absorber in the crisis. for example, Italy, which lays at the bottom of this resilience ladder, has a huge private sector wealth, which will provide, again, as I said, a shock absorber into that. This to mean that public policy is fundamental for resilience, fiscal space, etc. They're all very important variables, but also private wealth is important, culture is important, demography is important, solidarity, the Italian household, etc. So the civil society will be crucial in overcoming these difficulties. I stop here, and I'm happy to take any question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And absolutely perfect time. Absolutely spot on. Fantastic. Okay, next up, Veronica.
Thanks, Adam. Can you hear me well?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So again, thanks from me as well to the Global Government Forum for the invitation, and also for the comments from the other speakers, very interesting remarks. And I will try to, for this last leg of our prepared comments, to kind of weave it all together. Because we've heard of the fragility of our gains, you know, the exuberation of getting some good news, but also the fragility, how quickly things can trend back, and the consequences of the crisis that we've gone through from an individual trust level, from the public finance resilience perspective, from a sanitary crisis management going forward. So I think, I hope everyone would concur that no one has all the answers, but there is maybe value in bringing our heads together and trying to each one contribute to the best of our abilities. So for my intervention, I just want to bring to the attention of this audience an initiative that we're actually launching today at our Fall Summit. And it is very much a resilience program specifically around COVID. And I'll go into that in a minute. But I do want to offer a couple of words of contextualization and why, you know, as an organization, Swiss Re is even thinking of developing this pro bono platform, which is very much the data and analytics centered. And it is because, you know, ourselves being one of the leading companies in the world in the sphere of risk management, but also as an industry overall, we really see resilience as part of our mandate. In fact, it's in our motto, and we actually believe that this requires partnerships. So with that in mind, you know, how precisely do we contribute to societal resilience? And I'm hoping that both Domenico, Marcus, and Jerome will find some of their thoughts reflected in mine. So Domenico mentioned in particular the investment power of all agents in society. Well, definitely the insurance sector has a very important role to play there, because we represent 30 trillion of assets under management, but how we invest is not trivial. So for us, investing in assets that have long-term resiliency is very important, because this is the cash from the premium that we collect, that we put at use with the idea that, you know, 40, 30, maybe even 50 years later, we pay claims. So for us, that long-term resilience in the investment is important, and the macroeconomic environment and whether the investment produce an appropriate level of return is very important for us. So we typically, you will see the industry is very, very focused currently globally on ESG priorities. If we look at the clear, you know, value proposition that is unique to insurance, is very much about assessing risks, being partners in risk management, and taking those risks off the shoulders and diversifying it across. And traditionally, we use data to do that, the actuarial method. But I think it has a fundamental catalytic value, because with that risk-taking ability, we actually allow societies and economies to grow and innovate. And again, Domenico referred to the new fund and the greening of the economy, and that will require, that transition will require an important risk-taking ability from everyone, ourselves included. And finally, and that's the point I guess I want to spend more time on, is about our use of data. We are very avid users of data. There is no way we could do what we do professionally if we did not have data. And that has been historically based on backward-looking information, but ever more with digitalization, we have a real opportunity to help close the trillions of protection gaps that exist in the world, because we can complement the traditional information with new set of data, more continuous data information. And an example that is not maybe COVID specific, but it's important, is what we did, for instance, with the use of satellite data to develop new covers to protect areas that otherwise we would have never been able to protect in the past. So I think that's to say, in the current COVID situation, for us it wasn't a huge surprise in March that we would find ourselves facing a very challenging crisis, macroeconomic and sanitary crisis, because back in 2007, we already called out as an insurance industry at the CRO forum the fact that epidemics and pandemics in particular were going to be a growing issue in the future. And even my own team, already a few years back started working on pandemic covers, and we've taken a few to markets. So it wasn't completely surprising, but of course the level of preparedness is really what matters. And this is why back in March, as an organization, we really focused our efforts in integrating massively all the data that we had in-house and all the data that we could get our hands on that is publicly available, to put it all together on a platform. And in that, and the platform we utilize is the one with the Palantir colleagues, Palantir, because they are already a partner of choice for us for our internal purposes of data management and data integration. What I want to bring the emphasis on, that was a big surprise for me and the team that actually worked on that initiative, is that within a matter of literally weeks, we actually managed to get already some insights very quickly. And we weren't expecting that clarity of the information. And but also what we realized, it was fairly easy. If you know how to integrate the data, if you use the technology smartly, you can do a lot of things. But what we also realized, we couldn't be fast enough at developing the new ideas, the new questions, the models that are required to do a very solid scientific-based approach. And this is when we decided to reach out to prominent academic institutions around the world to explain what we were trying to do and invite them to be partners on this platform. So we integrated publicly available information. Now we have behavioral information, we have our own information, and we have literally 3 dozens of institutions, global institutions, that are partnering with us in developing new models and testing new correlation studies to address the questions that both Marcus and Domenico mentioned before. When is the right moment to re-entry? What is the right strategy for re-entry? How do we avoid a very broad brush approach versus a more fine-tuned, localized, relevant set of interventions? What are the key leading indicators to initiate this activity? Because when that happens, actually you can build trust, because it's a controlled model, it's a controlled approach to reopening the economies, but also what are the long-term consequences on mortality, on morbidity? What are the consequences of all those medical cases that have gone unaddressed for now nearly 9 months? And there is, Marcus talked about dentistry, but there is a very clear indication that there is a pickup in also cancer and other degenerative diseases because of lack of care. So a lot of interesting questions that only with a good scientific method and with a lot of data at hand we can resolve. And that brings us to where we are today. Today we have partners from the insurance industry and corporates that joined forces with us. Again, I want to emphasize this is a completely pro bono initiative. We're not trying to sell something, but it's the conviction that by bringing the different parties together, we can very much accelerate finding accurate answers to super important questions. And today we are also investigating with the event that I mentioned, we're fundamentally trying to answer 4 things. What data do we actually have, and where are the gaps that exist? What insights have we received? Currently we have 40 use cases across the globe that have been launched, and we have already the first set of results. very importantly, what are the attitudinal and behavioral things that we need to factor in because it's not just about the rationality of the decision. There is a lot of irrational, behavioral motivated distortions, and those need to be factored in. We can't presume that they don't exist. And last but not least, what are the visions, the possible models for managing these pandemics differently going forward, considering, and I really don't want to depress anyone, but our view is that this is not the first and the last pandemic that we will go through. In fact, the only pandemic that ever was completely controlled and vaccine had 100% penetration is smallpox. And, there will continue to be very prominent infectious diseases. So we have a choice to make on how we handle it going forward. And with that, maybe I would suggest, if it's possible, Adam, to show a little video, and we can go then into Q&A. Thank you.
Cue that up, please.
As the global COVID-19 crisis unfolds, one of the hardest challenges is bringing all the different data sources together in a usable way, which is why we've created the COVID-19 Response Centre for our own operational needs. The Response Centre provides the richest asset of relevant data possible, as well as the analytical tooling to help us design the operational scenarios required for informed action. At Swiss Re, we're committed to helping our partners and have mobilised to put our data analytics and modelling capabilities at your disposal. We want to share our COVID-19 Insurance Response Centre with you. Here's a walkthrough to show you how it works.
Let's walk through a specific example of a dynamic workflow enabled by the COVID-19 Insurance Response Centre. Logging into the COVID Response Centre homepage, we're greeted by the latest data, information, analyses, and models for both the global and local perspectives of the COVID crisis. At first look, I'm informed of the most important aspects of the Response Center. The data is recent, updated as of a few minutes ago. We see the community of contributing users alongside us. We see the latest metrics on the ongoing pandemic. And as a first-time user, we're given an instructive teach-along to showcase various important aspects of the Response Center's content and capabilities throughout. Synthesized from a wide variety and growing number of public data sources, the latest country-level COVID data is displayed on a dynamic, updating, live global map. Zooming into Europe, we can interact with a number of countries that have been hit hardest by COVID-19 thus far, comparing Italy and Spain with Germany, France, and the UK. Each of these countries has statistics available from the Near Real-Time Data Foundation powering the COVID Response Center. Details such as cases, deaths, recoveries, and fatality rates, as well as population demographics, hospital and healthcare effectiveness information, governmental guidance, interventions, and lockdowns. All of this live data lives here for quick access and reference, and we will be constantly adding to it to make this as complete and current a picture as possible in the next weeks and months to come. From here, we can move to a more localized view of one specific country and visualize the pandemic as it has evolved. Each day, as existing data sources are published and new granular data becomes available, it's hard to have the latest understanding of how the exponentially evolving crisis will ultimately unfold for a business. And it's difficult to take public-facing data and join that together with an internal, insurance-specific view. Ultimately, the world faces a data integration challenge. Underpinning the COVID Response Center is an integrated data foundation that has been developed using the Swiss Re Stargate platform, powered by Palantir Foundry. New ingestions from many different sources happen every few minutes, and additional data sources are added and enriched every few days. Already within this foundation are data sets from COVID-19 trackers, as well as published, trusted numbers from governmental institutions. Additionally, there are statistics per country, state, and county on population demographics, age distributions, and standard mortality rates. We can also find data on governmental interventions, healthcare-related information, social sentiment metrics, as well as financial and economic data. We will continuously be adding and enriching this data asset to keep abreast of events. Synthesizing all of this different information, the COVID Center provides a rich and coherent view of the current situation, per county, per state, and per country, as well as all of the historical information since the start of the crisis.
Adam,
Fantastic.
thanks. Can I just add one final comment super briefly? Obviously, we have a good ability as a firm at crunching numbers. What we don't have is an ability to design economic policies. So it should be no surprise for this audience that we just went to those that are first, that are mostly like us, right? You know, number crunching peers in the industry, in the financial sectors and beyond. But I think we would be very interested as part of this dialogue to really understand how can we work together? How can we use the data and the information and the models that we've developed together with academia through the Republic of Sciences? How can we make it available to you so that you can develop more substantiated public policies? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Veronica. Well, that's been fascinating, and we'll now go to questions. I will kick things off, but it really would be good just to remind everybody, the audience, that we are taking questions, and I will go to audience questions in about 15 minutes. I've seen we've got 3 or 4 coming in, which is absolutely fantastic. And just one apology, when I go to audience questions, I've just realized that I'm going to need to go quite close in order to be able to read the small text. So you're going to get a big close-up of my face when we go to audience questions. So I just apologize for that in advance. Okay, to kick things off, I think we better go with frankly, the news hook, which was the news of the Pfizer vaccine, which came in a little over 24 hours ago. In terms of rebuilding resilience, how different is the panel's thinking now compared to yesterday lunchtime? Domenico, can I go to you first, please?
Let me unmute. Yes, absolutely. Well, everybody defined the health cycle and the economic downturn associated to it to the availability of a vaccine, because otherwise it could have been an endless slump with everybody adapting and coexisting to the virus, but it's not normal, it's not viable. As I said, we will not go back to the old habits, but the availability of a vaccine is crucial. This is just the beginning, of course. I tend to believe that big pharmas like Pfizer communicate on a wise, pondered basis. So it's what they say is true, which no one can check at the moment, given the fact that the numbers are not available. But I believe there is in sight the end of this crisis. Then, of course, the virus can mutate over time, like in the normal flu. But until last week, to the non-experts like me, it was even debatable whether or not we were going to have a vaccine or not. And now it seems to be in sight.
Yeah, absolutely. Marcus, perhaps, I know you've touched on this already, but perhaps just answer my question directly. Marcus, can you hear us?
Yes. May I start by repeating what I said, or at least tried to set, that the negative news is now that the likelihood that there will be vaccine available in such quantities that it will affect the global pandemic or even a domestic epidemic before next summer is very low. Very likely there will be enough vaccines for given to health personnel and if we are very likely also for our parents and grandparents may go the vaccination next spring, but this will not really affect the dynamics of the pandemic or domestic epidemic, but the likelihood increases from next summer onwards that there will be vaccines available in such quantities that the real dynamics of the problem will change. But there are huge logistical problems. This new vaccine, what was announced yesterday, basically needs to be stored in storage of temperature between -70 and -80. So basically, in most advanced countries, even in most advanced countries, these kind of facilities are available only in good hospitals, not in kind of private health centers or public local health centers. And these logistical problems, how to distribute millions of vaccines and keep they constantly in so low temperature, it's a great challenge, and many things will basically come slower than you expect as this stage. But hopefully next autumn, and more likely at least early 2022, situation will look very different than now. Thank you.
Thank you. Veronica, can you can the research you're doing take account of the vaccine, the news of a vaccine? You know, how do you sort of count the hope factor?
So, so I think you quite correctly labeled it. It's a hope factor. I'm completely supportive of the value of vaccines, but I think Marcus is quite right. Between the operationalization of the production of the vaccine and the distribution, it will take a number of months. And he mentioned already the cold chain, which is a very critical operational issue, logistical issue, not to be underestimated. The other problem is, as for all vaccines, we do know that the efficacy changes based on the individuals, and there are currently various vaccines in production. But my hope is that we will have a number of alternative vaccines. Maybe some are more effective for younger generations, others for older. It is a very proven fact that the older we are, the less responsive our immune system. What that means is most likely, and you see it for the flu, although this is not the flu, right? But you see for the typical flu that the elderly need to take 2 shots, and it will take a little bit of time. So we don't know if the vaccine will be effective with 1 shot. We don't know if we need to do it every year. We don't know if parts of the population will simply require more inoculation because the effectiveness will be lower. We also don't know at this stage, as for anything that is new and experimental, what the side effects are. But I know from the conversations that I have with the public health authorities that if there is any negative side effect, there will be a massive intervention to take it off the market. So we're still going through a super accelerated process, which is the right thing to do given the very vast consequences that we've all witnessed and will continue to witness, both, you know, from a sanitary perspective and economic. But I would just be a bit more cautious that not everyone thinks that the vaccine is the answer. We actually need to have a concerted set of answers and actions, most of which is behavioral, understanding how certain behaviors and respecting certain norms really keeps us out of harm's way.
Thanks very much. Jerome, would you like to come in on this point?
Absolutely.
How's everything evolved in the last 24 hours?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's super positive news, no question about that. As mentioned before, it brightens up the macro outlook. However, and I think we shouldn't kid ourselves, the macro environment going into the COVID-19 hasn't been good. It hasn't actually been weaker than before the global financial crisis. This is why I think now it's even more important to rebuild and use this opportunity to make sure that we are on a more sustainable economic growth path. The vaccine itself, it will definitely help to get the sentiment back. It will help to get industries which have been hurt the most back up and running. However, it will take time. And what's more important, I think, is the structural damage is done. Fiscal buffers have been depleted. If you look, Adam, wherever you look in terms of government debt, it's just eye-watering increase. If you look at all the fiscal measures, just think about that. If you look at all fiscal and monetary measures over the last year, it has been more than all emergency measures around the world since the Second World War, and that's just in 1 year. Meaning, are we prepared to fight the next crisis? I think that's the real question. Pandemic, it's not a black swan. That's why I think this debate about resilience and what can we do in terms of data, what kind of economic policies can we build to build a better safety net for the next crisis. Global financial crisis was systemic, pandemic crisis was systemic, European sovereign crisis was systemic, despite all the private wealth also in Greece. There are so many topics around in terms of economic structure which can be improved, and let's see where we go. But definitely, I think this is a wake-up call to rebuild our buffers.
That's a perfect cue for my next question, actually, which is talking about rebuilding. A lot of people are also, and it's been mentioned by the panelists, people are talking about building back better as well, by which you mean the green growth and greening our economies. Is it possible to do both, to rebuild that headroom and make those investments? Given that you just finished up on that point, Jerome, I'll go to you first with that one.
Absolutely, it is possible, but probably it's the hardest thing to do. Don't forget the yellow vests in France. It's not so long ago, right? But it's the hardest to do because it requires long-term thinking in terms of economic policies. You need to think about the future, and knowing that climate change will even have great economic damages. I'm really convinced you need better data also in terms of climate change, because only if you have better data can you price the risk. And if you can price the risk, you can have insurance solutions and you can have capital market solutions, designing, surrounding, get a better track of climate change. But greening the recovery, just think about infrastructure investment. Think about renewable energies. This is very clearly providing jobs, has a high fiscal multiplier, and is good for our next generations. So I think there are many elements around which makes it possible. It's not an easy thing. It's not as easy just writing a check and buying securities out in the market, but definitely I think now the time is right for that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I'm aware we need to move to audience questions, but I do want to give other people a chance to comment on that if they want to. Domenico, I think it's not controversial to say that we were building up a bit of steam on the climate change front before 2008. But in my experience as a journalist, that fell away very quickly when people were firefighting in the wake of 2008. Do you think that this time it's different?
Well, the issue around climate change, policies against climate change, is that the debate is highly politicized. So people in favor of green development lay in a certain side of the spectrum, of the political spectrum, and the other against, which is a disgrace because we are talking about objective phenomena. When I was in the IPCC, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the first decade of this century, there was still lots of doubts and uncertainties around the evidence, which now seems to be seems to be established. So my point is that now it's crucial to push ahead with that, and with all the maybe indirect investments that facilitate the fight against climate change, say digitalization, working at distance, and all that. So I believe that while the short-run policy is fundamentally an insurance, so we are insuring ourselves against the pandemics to arrive at the other end of the cycle, be it public policy and public insurance, which is state intervention, be it insurance industry or even private via private wealth. Here we are talking future development, which is a completely different thing. But it's also similar to buy a future insurance in a sense. So it's crucial to push ahead in that sense.
Okay, fantastic. And Marcus, briefly, would you like to come in on this?
Perhaps it's better to to follow the questions from the audience.
Sure. Okay. And so, Veronica, unless you want to come in on the green growth agenda, then I'll move on to audience questions.
Sure, I think we've explored that. There are a couple of questions. I think someone asked about hospitals and what kind of data we have. I don't know if I'm over-interpreting it, but the data that we have on the what we just demoed.
Veronica, I'll just read out that question, if it's okay, and then the audience as a whole. So this is from Patricia Ludlow, who asks, is data collection solely based on hospital information, or is data collected from other resources?
Yeah, thank you. So it is actually over 100 different sources of information, but I have a colleague on the line, and I don't know if Pierre, you wouldn't mind answering that, because you've been part of the team that has been integrating data for the last 6 months.
Sure, and actually even better than talking about it, it's going to be showing. So we have over 1,000 different data sources that are integrated into the platform. Just for a bit of background, Pierre-Louis, I'm on the Palantir side, so the more technical side of how we're integrating everything into the platform. And so we can't show everything on the screen right now, but what you see is actually a good summary of everything that's happening. And so from left to right, you can read it, and every little colored box that you can see on the screen is actually a data set that has rows and columns associated to it, and that we're pulling into the platform, cleaning, aggregating together, and putting together so that the researchers and academics on the platform can actually work. And we're not just limited to actually a few data sources. We're pulling from information from a variety of open source data on the internet. We have academics that come see us and say, oh, we saw this model online, can you pull it in? Our platform is able to pull this data, clean it, and join it with the rest so that people can have a really complete picture. And on top of that, we have all the data that's coming from our partners. So for example, they mentioned economic data earlier. We work with Refinitiv, we work with Moody's. We work a lot with these providers who graciously recognize the importance of the situation here and allow all this research to be done on the platform. So we're pulling so many different data sources in, where in the end, it's all feeding into these unified data models of data sets that everyone can use very simply on the platform. So there's a wide array actually of information that's being brought in, and it's actually expanding day by day.
Okay.
May I add one short point on that? Well, first of all, I'm impressed by the model. I know very well Palantir, which is probably the best company in data analytics, so it's all good. But this tells us where to open, where to close, what to do, what are the spots where the damage is more severe. I'm not sure it helps designing a public policy, because a public policy in the pandemia, and the very word pandemia tells us about everybody, everything, needs to be addressed probably by cutting the risk pyramid in segments and leaving the public sector the biggest part of it.
So we don't say that we're going to find necessarily the answer to here, and that's why there's so many different actors. We've had people that wanted to analyze the impact on small business industry, and so we had a certain partner that was bringing that very specific data, and we were crossing it then with the segments of how different populations were affected in certain counties in the US. We have such a granularity here that we're not trying to solve everything at once, and oftentimes we have PhD researchers or actual academics who are here and who have one very particular thing they want to analyze. And so, for example, they'll say, we want to see how credit options are being affected by a certain type of aspect of the pandemic, and pulling all these different types of data together, they can perform their analysis on there. So we're not trying to fix everything, but even very unstructured data as well. So things like government measures, which are generally very hard to structure. When you think about a government measure, you don't think about it like an Excel table. We try and normalize it across countries and establish that Italy and France and this other country have had the same measures at different times in their history, and what's been the impact on the pandemic there.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We've got one other live question, which I'm going to go to now. I'll read it out. This is from Michael Wade. Did the World Health Organization fail us during December 2019? Should the WHO have been able to identify the COVID-19 threat? And if so, what should it have done at the time? And what do we learn from this? Who shall I go to first? Jerome, we haven't heard from you for a while. Nice and controversial question for you.
Yeah, very controversial. Well, I think it's important, right? First of all, without going into specifics and making specific remarks to WHO, I think it's really important that a pandemic knows no national borders, boundaries. That's why cooperation is so important. And obviously, faith and trust is also important for cooperation across countries. And I think in terms of the question before, what kind of right public policies there are, obviously one has to weigh against benefits for the economy and the health, and it's a balancing act, but data is always at the forefront. So I really don't know the answer in terms of specific question, but having more information, having more data out there, I think helps all risk assessment, whatever it is, but especially risk assessment, which is of global nature, like a pandemic right now.
Sure.
So I would leave it at there. Thank you.
Fair enough. Marcus?
I have to say that the question is so far away out of my knowledge that I'm not able to comment. Basically, I didn't follow any epidemic information prior to February this year, like civil servants in all countries. What has happened during this year? This is something which has learned us that these phenomena related to pandemic and epidemic could be very important, but the fact was that really few people followed these issues prior February this year.
No, I think that's accurate. Would anyone else like to come in on the WHO point?
Just say, I just want to build, Adam, on the point that Marcus just made with his simple but very powerful comment. It's not just a matter of having the data and the information, but having that connected to the people that then are mandated through government to take the decisions. And I think if there is a takeaway out of this entire pandemic is that we need to be better connected. We need to provide this information in a more timely manner. And we need to have a more embedded risk management framework. I know I sound like someone who's passionate about risk management because it's my industry. But you know, we believe that if countries had risk officers, that would make a very big difference, because it would be their job to keep an eye on all these existing and developing threats and trends, and then to think in an integrated fashion. It's impossible without a more professional figure, if you will, in government to get it done. I think overall, I would just say governments have done the best that they could. But there is a better way, and I hope that looking forward, we can all be partnering in a more substantive capacity, because we all suffer together and we all gain together.
Adam, I have a short remark on that, because I remember that the first time we were talking about the pandemic, which was not declared yet by the World Health Organization, was on March 5th. Because I was in a meeting with an editor of an Italian newspaper. Bear in mind that the measure, the policy to contrast these epidemics and this pandemia is huge. And it amounts to lock down everybody at home, etc. So even if the World Health Organization was late, and it probably was, we couldn't have closed our societies on a red flag. Because you don't do policies unless people own them and unless people see the risk. And at the moment, the risk was not completely perceived. So no matter whether they did it on time or late, and they probably did it late, but we couldn't have done much more than we did.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll go to you for your reflections from the session. So this is from John, and I'm afraid I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his surname. How long will it take for countries that depend mostly on specific industries, such as tourism and financial services, to recover from this crisis? So I suppose at the heart of that is, if a country is overly dependent on one sector, and that sector is disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, what hope is there? Who should I go to first?
I think one thing we should learn also with COVID-19 is the global economy is not a tape recorder. You can't just put it on pause or stop and then once you have vaccine, just play back again. Let's not forget all the fiscal stimulus. They were not grants, they were debt. They have to be repaired. So yes, great news for the service, for the hospitality, restaurant, airlines business. If you have the vaccine, can distribute it, but the debt overhang is still here, and that will wait, I think, on parts of the economy and on our economies in the future as well.
Veronica, is the data telling either particular places we need to be worried about?
So I think to the question about specific sectors, I don't feel confident in giving a number, say it's 3 months, but what matters more is actually the methodology. So the first thing is, first line, the employees that are affected. Anyone in the sector needs to ensure safety of the employees and then safety of the customers. Then there is a point of trust. Jérôme has also brought up a point of what is the spendable income. Overall, a lot of people throughout this pandemic have lost jobs and have tapped into their savings. So it's not that things will go back quite as quickly as we wished. I just think it is, so it would be a perfect question that I'd love to answer, for instance, pooling the data and the insight that we have. If someone said, can we do an analysis on sector XYZ in this country or in these 15 countries, that's the perfect question to bring up for the COVID Response Center, because we try to do predictions as well. We've used those predictions, for instance, for asset management. We look into what could happen in the next 3 months, and we don't use the traditional financial data. We look at mobility, we look at production. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do now that can give us early signs of whether the sector is going up or down. But maybe that's something, if anyone is interested in picking it up. I can see the question of the interdependency of the GDP, and there are economies that are highly dependent on 3 or 4 sectors in particular, and that's tough.
Maybe if you like me to add, if you look at the data which we receive and which is also on the Palantir platform from China, you can see China has managed the crisis much better than the other countries, and it took about 3 to 4 months for capacity return back to normal, as also showed in the GdP Shortfall Index. So it takes some time. Maybe Japan is not the best kind of example which can be replicated in other countries, but it will take time. I think that was the key message.
Okay, we're into our last few minutes. So if I could just ask each of you for the key takeaway from your perspective from this session. It's a cruel thing to do, but I've got to choose someone to go first. Marcus, could I go to you first, please?
One important aspect is that what happens in different countries are very much interconnected. First, the pandemic, by its real meaning, it's something what is common for all countries. And secondly, and this is something which I expect to be much more important in the future, there will be second round in economic terms, which will transmit by international trade, very likely also via financial markets, and this is something which we really should concentrate, at least in a small countries like Finland. Although Finland as such, we have survived the epidemic and direct economic consequences quite well. But now we are facing the fact that the big economies in Europe and also in North America are now facing the second round in epidemic, and this may affect our exports, and this is also something which should be looked very carefully in all export-oriented countries. So there might be something more traditional coming from the economy than the direct effects stemming from the pandemic.
Great, thank you. And we are just about out of time, so if I can ask the remaining panelists to keep their concluding thoughts quite brief. Dominica, I'll go to you first.
My key takeaway is that, and I knew it already, to be honest, is that we need a holistic approach. We need to see each country, each situation, but we also need to see the pandemics globally, of course. And science matters. The main difference to me is the availability, not availability of a vaccine, the existent or non-existent, and the depth of a second wave of infection, because that could influence dramatically the form of the recovery. So, and we are, I mean, this seminar, and I'm not trying to be nice to you, but it's true, shows that the amount of knowledge and the amount of data from the beginning of the crisis has improved a lot. Italy was probably the first country to enter the pandemia, and we knew nothing about that. While now it's a lot more understood. So this is what we need, and I believe that human ingenuity will pave the ground for a better future.
That's great, thank you. Jerome, and then I'll give the final word to Veronica.
I would have 3 points. Number one, recovery hill is still steep. Second, we need to rebuild economic resilience to fight the next crisis. And third, cooperation and data is key. Cooperation across countries, but cooperation with the private and the public sector.
Admirably pithy, thank you very much. And Veronica, last word to you.
I'll keep very brief as well. I just remind everyone this is the decade of action, and I know the pandemic got in the way, but there is no reason why we can't try and use the tough learnings through this experience to actually accelerate on the decade of action and really focus on models of the economy that are much more resilient with a higher expectations of one another. So I hope that we could inspire you to reach out to us and look for more collaboration going forward. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you. And thank you to all 4 of you. That's been a really interesting session. So thank you for giving up your time. And I hope you've got something out of it too. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the audience. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
You're a gentleman, sir. Goodbye.